waiting. The order of business today, as you know, today's goal is to have an opportunity to talk with and ask questions of the authors of this new paper that's just appeared in Nature. We're going to start off with the Iris's three co-founders. Julia Lane's going to lead us off, and then Bruce Weinberg, and then me, Jason Owen-Smith, and then we will turn to Q&A with the authors. So with that said, I'm going to, it looks like we have a query. Dan, will you look into putting on the closed captioning? We just got a question for that. So yes, we will endeavor to put on the closed captioning. There we go, closed captioning is enabled. We are going to begin with Julia Lane, who is one of Iris's co-founders. And Julia, I will hand it to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to be very brief. I'm just going to provide information about how this all came to happen, and then Bruce is going to talk through the presentation and the paper, and then Jason's going to give you some insights into the data that underpin this. And then our panelists, who are Matt Ross, Raviv Murciano-Goroff, Enrico Berkes, and Britta Glennon, are going to be responding to any questions you might have. We got some questions in advance, and then put some questions in the Q&A or in the chat, however you feel comfortable doing it. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a setup for this paper. So if you'll go to the next slide, Jason. All of this started in, I think in actually 2005, when Jack Marburger, who was a science advisor to the president, asked, how much should we spend on science? What kind of science? He asked for answers to lots of science policy questions, and really got the science of science policy going. A program was set up at the National Science Foundation that Kay Husbands-Feeling and I kind of initiated. And there was a real interest in building data and evidence for science policy. Of course, that's now been mirrored across other domains with this whole push for evidence-based policy in the federal government. From a practical point of view, if you'll go to the next slide, or to the transition, the kinds of questions he asked resonate today. And what he's really asking for, next slide, is, I love this New Yorker cartoon. On the left-hand side, we spend money. On the right-hand side, we get outputs. What we really are trying to do with evidence-based policy and data, and certainly with the metrics data, is be a bit more explicit in step 2. Instead of just saying, oh, we're going to spend money and get outputs, grants don't do anything. And papers don't do anything. What is step 2? Step 2 is the people. So what we started to build back in 2009 in response to the era, next slide, was effectively saying, what's our conceptual framework? So it's been quite natural to say, okay, well, we've got data on money, on spending, and we've got data on patents and publications. And just to try and mechanically connect the two, what the insight was with the U-metrics and STAR metrics, which was its forerunner, was to say, no, what you really want to do is science's work, its organizational structures. See, I'm an economist, right? So I talk about work. Sociologists think about organizational structures. So I'm learning from I was going to say betters, but that's stretching it a little bit. It goes to institution, it goes to people. So understanding how those people are organized and how they work to produce science sits at the core of a science of science policy, not just a miracle of science policy. So now we're about to hear about a particular application that has captured a lot of attention. So I'm going to turn it over to Bruce.
Thanks very much, Julia. I'm going to transition to another set of slides, and then we'll have Bruce
Bruce is an economist with Ohio State University. I should have introduced myself. I'm an economist at New York University. So transitioning over to Bruce at this point.
Okay, for some reason, it is not wanting to change off of your slides, Julia. This the machine loves you. So I'm gonna try again. And still, no.
You need to download it, I think.
I have it downloaded. It's just it turns out I needed to close yours, it looks like. So let's see if this works.
I told you that sociologists were not as good as economists in many ways, and technology is one of them.
Yes, people study what they don't understand, and I'm a sociologist of innovation and technology. With that said, I'll hand it over to Bruce. Bruce, please take it away.
Thanks, guys, and thanks everyone for being here and hearing about what we did. So the piece is here. Its starting point is that there are gender differences in observed output. There have been a variety of explanations that have been advanced for this. We're suggesting that maybe the observed output isn't the actual output, and that women in fact receive less credit for the contributions that they make than men do. And the canonical example over on the right is that of Rosalind Franklin, who was very famously, whose role in discovering the structure of DNA was very famously overlooked. And I should say at the bottom of the slide, I know many people from our funders are here today, but this work required an immense investment from many entities and people, and we are incredibly grateful to everyone for making this possible over these many years. Next slide, Jason, please. So the problem that we have here is not unique to us. It is about finding what isn't there from what is there. The sort of the fun example is the airplanes that trying to figure out where to put armor on airplanes in World War II, and they looked at the airplanes that came back and saw where the bullets were and said, oh, well, this is where we need to arm them to prevent them from being shot. But in fact, those are the places where you didn't need to put the armor. You needed to put the armor in the places where the planes didn't make it back in order to protect them. For the economists here, there's sort of a well-known issue in terms of estimating the returns on managers, fund managers, but when you only observe the fund managers that are successful enough to survive and don't see the fund managers that don't survive. Next slide, please. So just to provide a sense of the data, and that's really one of the core enabling assets and something that we want to talk to people about. So hopefully people can take these data and use them for other purposes. We're starting with roughly 130,000 people who are working on roughly 10,000 projects and 10,000 teams over a 4-year period. Those teams produce about 40,000 articles and 7,500 patents within the next year, although we have robustness checks that we explore different approaches. And basically what we do is we cross every person on a team with all of the articles and all of the patents that those teams produce. We have linked so we've linked the publications and the patents to the individual authors, as well as to the projects and teams that are producing them. And we can look at roughly 18 million potential authorships. That is a particular person who is on a team that produces an author, that produces an article or a patent, and see whether they are actually listed as an author on an article or inventor on the patent. We've imputed gender. It's a binary and static measure, which is not our preference, but what is necessary. And then we have a bunch of rich data such as occupations and the time allocated to projects and imputed fields that we'll use. Next slide, please. So this slide shows some of our core results. On the x-axis, we have the share of women among potential authors, and on the y-axis, we have the share of women among actual authors. If you focus on the left panel, this is breaking things down by field, by occupation. The right panel breaks things down by field. And on the left panel, the labels are a little small, but if you look at the southeastmost circle, that is the large one, that is for faculty, and faculty have a relatively small share of women. And then if you move over to the right, the far right, to the northeast, you have research staff, and those have a much larger share of women.
Bruce,
yes.
Bruce, if I could, can I do color commentary?
Sure.
You could smile. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So part of the reason that this data is so interesting is one of the reasons that has been said that women publish less than men is that women are in more junior stages of their career, or they're in different fields. And what this is showing is that regardless of their stage of career, they're being less likely to be cited as authors. So I think that's the key point that you're making, right, Bruce?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 points here. I think one point is that there are differences in terms of the occupations that men and women are in, and women tend to be in the occupations that inherently are less likely to be credited. And then the second point is that if you look, as Julia was saying, at the 45-degree line, if all of these points were arrayed upon the 45-degree line, that would say that women were equally likely to be listed as authors on articles, that they would be realized as authors on the y-axis, as they would be potential authors on the x-axis. And what we see is all these points are beneath the 45-degree line, both when you look by career stage on the left and when you look by field. So while there are differences in where women are located, and those are related to the probability of being listed as an author, even within these categories, women are less likely to be listed as authors than they are than the baseline rate at which they appear in the population, than if they were evenly represented as authors. Next slide, please. So we have done, we have a wealth of controls that we can include. In the left, here on the left, we have articles, and the right, we have patents, and we want to control for all of the rich controls we have to see whether these can eliminate the differences in attribution rates that we identify. So we include the length of time and controls for principal investigators and job titles and the fields that people are in. And then ultimately in the rightmost column in each panel, we can control for fixed effects for the specific research teams, so that we can say, whether women are less likely to be listed as authors than men, or inventors than men, in among people on a specific research team. And what you can see in the rightmost column in each panel is that there's about a 15% gap in the probability that women are listed as authors relative to men on articles, and about a 60% gap in the probability that women are listed as inventors on patents relative to men. And so, I mean, while there's a very large gap among authors on articles, there's an enormous gap in terms of the probability that people are listed as inventors on patents. Next slide, please. We've also we've matched these data to citation data, and we can show that, which I think is one of the most disturbing findings, but consistent very much with the Rosalind results, that as the citations to an article increase, the probability that the gap in the probability that a woman is listed compared to a man increases, so that women become less likely to be listed on the most important outputs from their teams. And I think that's disturbing in two ways. One, it means that the work that's most important for advancing people's careers, women are excluded from. But then I think the second thing is, these are the articles where presumably the team spent a lot of time focusing on that piece. They didn't write it quickly and just send it out. And so presumably one would have thought that people would have been particularly careful in thinking through who should be authors. And those are the pieces where women are most likely to be excluded. Next slide, please, Jason. So, we produced all these quantitative results based on U metrics, and I think that was really a core component of what we did. But we also wanted to understand the mechanisms and corroborate the results that we had, and then hear voices of people who had gone through this, which were in many cases very, very poignant. And I think I encourage you to read the article and tweet the article and do that. But if you read one portion of the article, perhaps this is the most gripping and haunting portion of the piece, to read what people actually had to say. And I encourage you to do that. So we looked at people who had recently written papers that were in the Web of Science, who we could obtain email addresses from. We heard from 2,660 people. 43% of women reported that they had ever been excluded from an article, compared to 38% of men. We asked people why they had been excluded, and women said that their contributions were underestimated by their peers, and just that there was outright discrimination. And men were much more likely than women to say that their contributions simply didn't warrant authorship. We also took papers where people were listed as authors, and we asked them what contributions they had made according to CASRA's credit system. And we find that women are actually list more contributions that they make to articles than men do. We asked for open-ended responses, where people could type in their experiences and ask people if they would be interested in talking to us. And I'm going to present on the next slide some results from that, because as I say, they were some of the most striking results that we had. Next slide, yeah, great. So I think there were 4 basic points that emerged, and as I say, the narrative responses are really rich, and this only begins to do them justice. I think the first thing was that it's confusing for people to know what constitutes a contribution that would warrant authorship, and that women often don't ask to be listed as authors. I think a second point that emerged is that there were very complex power dynamics and a lot of politics in terms of authorship. A third thing was that being excluded as an author had enormous professional consequences for people. This quote comes from someone who basically says that she's left in the teaching jobs because she was excluded as an author from these papers. And the fourth is that this was emotionally very, very costly to people and really hurt people emotionally as well as professionally. So I'll conclude on the next slide, Jason. And just say, I think, this is, we think, the tip of the iceberg here. We think that, one of the things that we hope to do is to look at other dimensions of underrepresentation, including race and ethnicity and international status. We would love to think of ways of looking at non-binary and fluid genders, which I think are a limitation of what we have. But I think much more deeply, if you go past this particular piece and you think about these data, they provide the infrastructure to look at rich longitudinal analyses of what is funded and who is funded, and the teams that are producing research, and then specifically what they actually are producing at this point. And we can use differences in institutional policies to provide natural experiments to look at all kinds of outcomes, such as retention and productivity of researchers, placements and career trajectories of their trainees, and commercialization and the economic impacts of people's activities. So I will stop at this point and then turn it back to the executive director of IRIS, Jason Owen-Smith, who is a sociologist at the University of Michigan.
Thanks very much, Bruce. I'm going to see if I can make sure that I actually get the slide shared correctly this time. as you've seen from Julia, the origins of U-metrics from Bruce, and we'll soon turn to the panel of authors for the core, the meat of this discussion. A great use case, one that we're very, very proud to see come out of this work. I want to share just briefly some thoughts about how these data can be used and accessed. And so part of the message we want you to hear in this is not just that this is a super cool paper, it is, and not just that there are really interesting pieces of work that can be done with it, there are, but also that this paper and things like it rest on an infrastructure which is designed and supported to curate these kinds of data and make them available as broadly and responsibly as possible for researchers. And so it's important when you think about all that you've heard so far and all that you will hear to realize that this is not just us telling you about a cool piece of paper, a cool piece of work that's been done. It's also an invitation to you to bring your topics and concerns and questions to these kinds of data, and in so doing, to help us as an institution, IRIS, to continue to develop them. So IRIS itself, the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science, has been around since 2015. That's when we were founded. It's anchored at the University of Michigan, and formally it's an IRB-approved data repository. But what it really is the anchor of a consortium of big universities, many of them, who share this really rich data that, as Julia described, allow us to take an essential step, we think, for the science of science policy, science of science, right? And that's the step from data on documents and dollars to data on people and teams, right? And what you're seeing here in the paper you've just seen is exactly the value of that, because what it allows you to do is to see the population of people working on a project associated with outcomes of various sorts, and to situate them in their social and organizational context. IRIS has released now 5 progressive data releases starting in 2017. The most recent, our 2022 data release, includes information at a transaction level, micro level data, about more than 535,000 federal and non-federal funded awards on more than 80 campuses. This covers about $127 billion worth of spending, including wage payments. This is the team data that Bruce and Julia and all of the other authors of the paper have been talking about, to more than 864,000 people. So when we're talking about the kinds of things that can be done with these data, the shift from documents and dollars to people and teams, we're actually talking here about a very sizable and growing corpus of data. It's been used really broadly. There have been nearly 100 papers published out of these data. The piece that you're hearing about today is one of the very highest profile and also the most recent. And so that's exciting. But it's also important to note that work is being done with these data on a huge range of fields, everything from higher education and economics and engineering to sociology and operations management and computer science. More than 450 researchers from 135 institutions have accessed these data and are using them for their research. And so we want to encourage those of you who are researchers to think about this as a resource, especially in light of what you're hearing from the paper today. We also want to encourage those of you who support researchers to direct them in this way. The other thing to say about IRIS is that these data are valuable immensely in filling in that step 2 that Julia described. I too love that New Yorker cartoon, but they also provide really, really wonderful ways to get into some of the key pressing questions about science and engineering, its practice and its impact that we haven't been able to see before. And so these are just some snapshots of the kinds of things that we have been doing work with at IRIS, that we have produced both research on, but also data products that are used by universities, funding agencies, associations to understand, explain, and we hope improve the workings of science. So in some ways, IRIS is a machine for getting research done, but also translating that research back into rich evidence that can be used for policy at all levels. You see that in this framework, what we also see is that this research can be translated quickly. So one of the benefits of data like these is that the data come to us very recently. Right? So the paper you're looking at uses data through, I believe, 2020. The U-Metrics 22 data release has data through the end of 2021, and in some cases into the first quarter of 2022. Those data allow us to speak to emerging issues. These are just some snapshots of work we've done right at the beginning of the pandemic around COVID, where we made use of monthly data starting in February of 2020 through June of 2020. This data were analyzed in 2020 to make sense of what came out. So I want to make the point, not just that there is long-term research to be done or that there is data product and impact, but also that the evolution of these data and the connection to research that you're seeing here creates new possibilities for the interplay between science and policy that we haven't seen before. Finally, I'll just highlight a couple of things to say these data are also broadly used for a wide range of papers. So, a recent piece that Bruce and I were part of that describes new linkages between the U-Metrics data and the survey of earned doctorates. Another piece out of Bruce's team from Science Advances, and universities that participate make direct use of these data in their own descriptions of their research and in their own workings. And so the picture I want you to take from this is, as I said, an invitation to join a community where data becomes the core of both new discoveries and of application aimed at improving policy and practice in science. And with that said, obviously we're here to talk about this paper. And so I'm going to end. I see Q&A starting out. And so I'm going to do a little moderation. I wanted to start with a question to the panel. Which is basically, could you all talk a little bit about the ways in which you see your work being different than other work that has analyzed gender gaps in science, and what you think the real value of the differences are? And then we have some questions that I will start to raise, and also some that came in from the panel. But please, would one of the panelists take it away?
I can take this one, and feel free to add on if I miss anything. So I think the big differentiating factor is really what Bruce raised in his presentation, which is that much of the existing work on the gender gap in science has really focused on explaining, taking the output as a given, as the true output, right? And inferring based on that what the differences are in, perhaps productivity or something like that, right? And what we're doing here is actually a step before that, right? And looking underneath the hood and actually examining, who might not be seen at all in those outputs and who might be underseen in those outputs, right? And really looking at, not inferring from the outputs, but inferring from the effort, right? And inferring from the, the collaborations underneath. So that to me is kind of where we really distinguish ourselves.
Great. Does anybody else want to add thoughts to that, or shall we?
I think that I would also just say that doing this at scale is something that hasn't been done before. I mean, we're looking across every single field, across different levels of seniority for the different scientists. And I think while we've had some anecdotes, we've had some case studies, we've had some studies about particular labs, particular departments. This is really bringing it up to the point where we can get a sense of what's the magnitude across fields, across different aspects of science.
Great. So another question, this one came in from a participant when we start off, which is, you all do a really nice job of analyzing authorship or no and authorship on papers of different impact. But the question was, is there also a correlation between gender and getting relegated to the et al? of the paper, or I would read that perhaps as author order. Can you talk a little bit about attributions of credit in that sense?
I'll take it. So in the technical appendix, which I don't know is posted or not online yet, but we did actually do some estimates where we looked at author position and whether the gender gap changed across author position. And then related to another project, but not necessarily in this paper, we also looked at the acknowledgement section and whether there were gender differences of people that didn't necessarily make it to the authorship list, but ended up in the acknowledgements. And what we found was that there was relatively consistent. I mean, they varied in magnitude, but the disparity was present. The gender gap was present across all of those different dimensions.
Other thoughts? So I'll briefly respond to a question that was put in Q&A and that I answered, which is to say, the question was, do we have data on agriculture and particularly USDA data? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, some earlier work that Julia led to a book about food safety research that drew strongly on agricultural data in these data sets that work went on. And so I'm going to ask Julia if you wanted to say something about that really briefly before we turn back to the panel.
Sure. Now we are limited to some extent in describing the research by what the agencies provide. But in that book, we were able to pull out USDA research specifically, because one of the unique things about the data is the data are hosted at universities. So we have all grants from all sources. And so you're able not only just to see what USDA research has supported, but agricultural research from all sources of funding. So that was one of the things that was remarkable about being able to look at food safety research, because a lot of it was from NIH, from NSF, as well as from the US Department of Agriculture. And it was really interesting to see the overlap in the fields. We didn't have as rich data from USDA, unfortunately, as we did from NIH and NSF. So we would encourage, obviously, USDA to provide richer information so that we could dig more deeply into the agricultural research.
Great.
Particularly, sorry, one more thing. Particularly, I think since that, Jason, you might want to talk about the efforts that you are making to bring in data from public land grant universities, as well as in order to understand the diversity issues from Hispanic serving institutions and historically Black colleges and universities.
Yep, I'm happy to talk about that, but I want to make sure that we do this. I will say that we are actively working right now to expand both the land grant university representation and especially representation for minority serving institutions. We're hopeful that we may be able particularly to get better data from the 1890 land grants, which, as Julia suggests, are traditionally HBCUs. So we have another question that's come in for the panel, which is for the result on the larger gender gap in patents relative to journal articles. Is there any way your findings can distinguish between receiving credit and the potential that women are less connected to industry contacts or less likely to perceive patenting as a valuable goal, as documented by Ding et al.'s 2006 piece in Science?
I'll take this again. If somebody else wants to jump in at the end, they can feel free. You know, while I think that it's possible that those things are going on, I think the way that I would think about it with respect to our analysis is that, you know, the women on the team that we're looking at are actively participating in the research. So for instance, if there's an industry contract, to work on a project that yields a patent, we're actually observing the women and the men that are working on that research project. And then we're looking at the output in terms of who is and isn't on the patent. So, while it might be true that women are less likely to be on, funded research from industry or less likely to be involved in patenting, we're sort of exclusively looking at the team and the project that's involved in that activity and then the output from that activity.
Do others want to add thoughts on connection to industry or orientation, or shall we have another question?
I mean, I might just say, I think this is, I think this is a very important question that bears future study. I mean, patents are unique in the sense that there's a formal legal structure around who should be listed as an inventor on a patent. And given that the gap on inventorship is 4 times the size as the gap on, I mean, the baseline rate is much lower, but given that the gap is 4 times the size as it is on articles, that's suggesting that this is women are either not asserting themselves or are systematically not being included specifically on the patents. And I think it's that much larger gap certainly bears additional analysis.
Great.
And
I'd also note that-
Britta
Go
and
ahead.
Raviv, I think you have some quotes that kind of cut to the core of that. Do you want to kind of use the author's own words?
So I don't have a specific quote up right now, although I can look for this, right? But I mean, I think there are, in these really high profile cases, right? So a lot of the instances of women being left off of papers, when they talked about it in the survey, they often really talked about like these high profile papers and how much, there was, the PIs on the patent or the more senior people on the patent or certain men on the patent or whoever, right, would really wanted to get credit for it. And we're kind of obsessed with getting credit for that. And there was a power dynamic going on. And I think a lot of the elements that are true in any paper, right, which is that, the people who work on it want to get credit for the work. It matters a lot for your career. It matters a lot for, everything that comes afterwards. All of those factors become especially important for high impact, right? There's far fewer patents than there are publications. And so one might expect this to be especially true for patents, right? And so I think just, from the survey open-ended responses and from the interviews, this is in some way not surprising that you would see such a bigger gap for patents, because these are such high impact and they really elevate a lot of the factors that are driving the gap to begin with.
Yeah, I think the way that we've talked about it, Britta and I have talked about it before, is that when there's, a paper that, ex ante, no one knows how many citations a paper is going to get, but everybody sort of informally knows a winner when there's a winner. So, anytime that there's a patent that's about to come out, or a big paper, it seems, we sort of think that there tends to be more jockeying for authorship slots, and those are the ones where women tend to lose out more in terms of getting on the authorship list.
I would also just say, it's sort of going back to what Matt said in the beginning. I think that if you thought that there was some difference in preferences, right? We're not sort of observing preferences, but if you thought that there was a difference in preferences, you wouldn't necessarily think that would actually happen if, for example, you've put in years of work in a lab, that you would sort of see that gap. If you've invested sort of, that much time working on a project, then we would expect that if there's going to be a patent that comes from it, or if there's going to be a paper, then you are at the very least sort of deserving of consideration for being on that co-inventor list or co-authorship list. So the fact that we see this, not just in sort of people that might have put in a small amount of work, but that we see this for people that put in a lot of work. The fact that we see this for people that are of faculty level and senior positions, where it's not like they're unaware of kind of you know, what it means to get a high impact paper, what it means to get a high impact patent, you know, to be a co-inventor on that. I think that the fact that we see this sort of across all of those different levels and parts of the distribution really means that there's a lot that needs to be investigated, and that it's unlikely to, or at least it sort of should at least be sort of further teased apart if it really is something about preferences, because it seems like that would be hard to explain that part of the distribution.
Mm-hmm. Great. So another question came in, and it relates to one that was submitted earlier, which is basically a question about how you all built the data. One of the things that's most impressive to me about this paper, obviously I love U-metrics, I have a lot invested in it, but this also pulls together the U-metrics data with survey data. You've just heard the richness that's added by qualitative data. So the question that was asked is, you mentioned that your analyses considered the email of researchers, and I understand there are no email data in U-metrics, obviously, so those emails were taken from publicly available sources like U-metrics. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the data build itself, the strategy, the work that went into it, and how you put together not just the variables from U-metrics, but the component pieces.
Maybe we could get, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly address the email part. So I think the emails are in the survey piece. We don't do anything with emails in the U-metrics data because there is no email information in the U-metrics data. The emails were part of the survey strategy, right? So just how to contact scientists. And it was, you know, not all of them were institutional emails. It's whatever email people put down as the corresponding author is often where these came from, for example.
Mm-hmm. So Enrico, you've been fairly quiet so far. Do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the data build?
Yeah, so for so what Britta said was regarding the survey, and for the empirical analysis. So the first part of the paper, we linked U-metrics data to the Web of Science, and we used a new approach to do this matching that is based on the first, in the first step, we do this matching using the awards that are acknowledged by the papers, and we link them to the awards that are reported in U-metrics, and then we look at the names of the authors in the Web of Science and in U-metrics. And then we extend this matching by looking at the network of co-authors of the people that we were able to match. And so this expands the matching that we are able to, you know, the papers that we are able to link to people in U-metrics. And yeah, and then thanks to the richness of U-metrics, we are able to build teams in which people have worked, and we are able to observe the effort that people put in these awards, in these projects, and also their occupations, their role within the lab. And this allows us to, you know, to do our analysis, our empirical analysis in the paper.
Okay, thank you. So I think the other set of questions that we're hearing here that I would be really interested in having people talk about a little bit is implications. So what kinds of implications are there of this gap for careers? And are there ways you could imagine U-metrics data and the kinds of strategies you all have developed addressing those or better understanding those implications for careers?
I'll start. You know, the way that I sort of talk about this piece to folks and about, you know, specifically about why they should care about the results from this, There's been an ongoing discussion about, the leaky STEM pipeline and gender disparities at STEM. And typically that conversation is focused on, women's participation in STEM at the undergraduate and graduate level. And I think this paper in particular is, germane to that discussion because, if we think that there's these disparities in terms of, getting credit and promotion and tenure for women, there's going to be a much smaller share of women in leadership roles in STEM. And if we want to increase the number of undergraduates enrolling in STEM majors, we should really be concerned about the number of women in STEM. I think, separately from that, if you were, this is obviously not us as co-authors, but if you're someone that perhaps doesn't care about equity issues whatsoever, right, and you're just simply concerned with producing the best science that the US can produce, right, the literature says that more diverse teams produce, better science. And so, we should be concerned with promotion and credit opportunities for women and for other historically marginalized groups because, more diverse teams are going to produce better science. And so, those I think are at least from my perspective, two of the most important policy topics that come out of this paper.
Yeah, so just to kind of build on that. So again, we don't directly look at impact on careers in this paper. And I think U-metrics absolutely could be used to do this, right? Because we have the longitudinal element in U-metrics. So you very much could see, now that we're sort of reaching a longer panel in U-metrics, could start to see the outcomes on careers. But, there's a couple reasons why you might expect it to really impact a woman's career. So one is that all promotion decisions are based on the publications and patents that are seen. And so if you're not named on patents and publications, especially the high impact ones, you're much less likely to get promotion. And I think there's also a discouraging impact, right? And so if you are an undergraduate or a graduate student and you see the senior women or the junior women in your field not getting the credit they deserve, you're going to be really discouraged about following that path, right? And so I think, we'd be very surprised if there were not severe career consequences for those reasons.
And I'd like to jump in and say, as many of you know, we're partnering with the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics and linking U-metrics to the survey of doctoral recipients and then as well as the survey of earned doctorates. So you can see from the U-metrics data whether graduate students leave before completing the doctorate. And then you can also look at their careers in the survey of doctoral recipients. So as the U-metrics base grows and the number of institutions that participate grows, you'll be able to see how the way in which people are given credit in a particular team can affect their career outcomes. And I'm going to say this paper is purely descriptive, but with the links to the Survey of Earned Doctorates, the SED, and the Survey of Doctoral Recipients, you can actually see how changes in PIs, principal investigators, because they move from one institution to another. About 10% of PIs change every year. You could see how institutional changes and policy changes at the department or at the university level can affect potentially research. And from the point of view of the science of science policy, what a thought. You could actually figure out the effect of institutional changes, project differences, and design experiments to see what has an impact and what does not. And Pierre Azoulay has called for a more theoretically informed basis upon which to be making science investments in science. And that, after all, was the entire goal of developing this infrastructure, to start to instead of just saying, oh, well, we think that it would be good to have pioneer programs, or it would be good to have cross-disciplinary, or it would be good to do X, Y, and Z. As you're doing an intervention as a science agency, you can design experiments where you could document the impact. And they do that in lots of other areas, as everyone on the panel is well aware.
So a question that jumps off from that we received, and then I'll circle back to a couple of new ones that came in on Q&A. But as you think about these impacts on careers, I'd like to ask you to reach a little bit beyond the very rigorous and well done analyses, to think about what might some best practices be that you could envision, or what kinds of interventions might we envision to help remedy this sort of gap, or to change the ways that credit is allocated and work is understood in academia to address this sort of inequity.
I guess I would start with sort of there are kind of three things that come to mind, although each of these kind of policies would need to be evaluated and thought about sort of what the full effect is of them, to ensure that they were kind of creating the outcomes that we desire. But sort of the three things that you might think about are, number one, sort of first starting by kind of creating clear and consistent guidelines for whose contributions and what types of contributions should warrant consideration as a co-author or co-inventor. As Bruce mentioned, there's sort of a legal standard for patents, but for publications, then thinking about kind of creating those guidelines, making sure that they're appropriate for all different fields, and making sure that PIs are aware of what those standards are, as well as scientists in the lab are aware of when they should be feel like they should be advocating for themselves to get that recognition. This was a clear theme that came out from the survey and interviews, that often there just weren't clear and consistent guidelines, and that was very frustrating and created the potential for for overlooking individuals. The second thing that I would mention is that we should spend some time thinking about how to train PIs to, first of all, recognize the contributions of everybody within the lab, to make sure that they have their eyes open and their ears open for hearing what everybody's doing, and that they should make sure that it's an environment, that their labs are environments in which people are able to sort of stand up and make sure that they have their voice heard, that they have their contributions heard by the PI. And then third, I think that we want to make sure that this type of reporting kind of keeps happening, and that there's a way to kind of measure how much of an attribution gap do we see? Is that getting smaller over time? And then to be able to say, when some of these types of policies get rolled out, do we see that the attribution gap seems to be getting attenuated, or do we see that it's not going away? So I think that sort of reporting and continuing to collect this type of data is really important as well.
Do others have thoughts they want to share on that?
Yeah, I'll just add, just to put that in context, as from the perspective of someone that works in discrimination or issues of disparity and discrimination in a variety of settings, I think the one thing that the literature clearly states is that, anytime that you have these discretionary decisions where there's not really a codified set of rules is where, potentially implicit bias creeps in. I mean, anytime you talk about disparities, people have this picture in their mind of this bad apple story where there's these rogue PIs that are, aggressively targeting women and excluding them from papers. When in fact, I think, what is more often or more frequently the case is that, there's really a lot of discretion in terms of the PI and in terms of who they award credit to. And it's more about, perhaps giving people a break that didn't necessarily do as much work. And maybe the PIs don't even realize that that's going on. So I think to Raviv's last point, I think something that, nature requires this, but most journals don't, is, explicit author contribution statements, and just having the PI sort of fill out even just a really rudimentary description of who did what on the paper and sort of putting that out there for them to think about, I think would actually go a long way.
Great. So we're coming to the end of our hour. This has been a really rich discussion, and I want to sort of end it on a high note. So what I'm going to suggest is that we do a quick round robin of the authors and just ask each person in a brief moment if there is something that they would want to say about the paper or its implications that we haven't covered. So I'm going to go in the order on my screen, which means I'm going to start with Britta. If you don't mind me putting you on the spot, Britta.
So I mean, I think there would be a couple things that I would point out as being especially important, and we've touched on them here already, but just to kind of emphasize them again. One is, thinking beyond just measuring output, right? And thinking more clearly about what goes into that output. And, U-metrics obviously allows us to do that. And the other thing is we've talked, so the assignment of credit matters a lot, and it's inherently important. And, I think this is true for women as well as for other, underrepresented minorities. But what's even more important probably is sort of the impact on careers, right? And the impact, the long-term consequences, which we don't explicitly get at in this paper, but I think is a really important implication that could be overlooked.
Great. Enrico, what would you want to make sure that we hear?
Yeah, building on something that Matt said before and that Britta just mentioned, I believe that the impact on careers is particularly important. Like, not only diverse groups are believed to produce a better innovation, but it might be the case, and hopefully it is the case, that they also produce innovation or research that represents better society. There is evidence that in medicine, diseases that are more prevalent in women are understudied, exactly because women are underrepresented in the profession. So by allowing people to, or by allowing research to be a more inclusive environment, we are also making sure that the research that we are producing is a reflection of the society we are living in.
Great, thank you. Matt, what would you like to add to this?
I think one takeaway for me that stood out that, I guess I wouldn't say I was surprised by, but I think I was surprised to the extent of it, is that from the survey, we really learned that these types of, this issue with credit really cuts across a number of different dimensions. As Britta sort of alluded to, we really learned that these issues, this issue of attribution cuts along historically disadvantaged groups, minorities, women, also, folks from non-US institutions and even lower ranked or universities. I think that in particular is something I think that warrants future research, and that, I was particularly surprised by from the survey results, is just the extent of which that this is an issue.
Raviv, I think you get the last word here as we come to the top of the hour. So anything you want to add?
I think that just one of the findings that I think was really interesting and definitely sort of demands some additional examination of is when we did the survey, then we asked individuals, conditional on being named on a paper, what did you contribute to that? And what we found is that, women had a higher propensity to be involved in almost every aspect of the paper, the data analysis, the writing of the paper. And I think that sort of thinking about who's doing what on these teams and what those thresholds are for actually getting onto the paper, and basically thinking about the other side of the coin. We thought about, if you're working on a paper and don't get named, but also conditional on getting named, how much did you do for that paper is sort of another aspect of this that I'd love to sort of see additional examinations of. And I think is a really interesting point that we put forward from the survey.
Great. Thanks very much. And so speaking of teams, I want to thank this entire team. This is, for social science, a fairly big team, and has put a ton of work into this to produce what I think is a really lovely piece of work that both makes an important contribution in its own right, and that very much, to me, demonstrates both the need for and the value of this kind of work. And so I think Bruce put into chat the final comment from himself, and I'd reiterate that, as I said, Umetrics is a resource that we as a group both use and have also built for the community to use. And we encourage you to reach out to us, particularly to me and to the staff at IRIS, if you're interested in learning more. And from there, I'll say thank you to everybody for participating in what's been a great conversation.